So good morning, everyone. Welcome to the session of the training program on socially generative innovation for development. We will continue on our focus on data collection methodologies and methods. The last three sessions, you have been introduced to various ideas on approaches and different kinds of approaches to collect data and engage in data practices which result in generative outcomes. So today, as a continuation on our focus on data, we will look at a critical aspect called the social value map for understanding how people derive value out of infrastructure in their lives and achieve sustainable well-being outcomes. Before we begin to discuss about the process of social value map, let us do a quick recap of what we have gone through so far and understand as key characteristics of the generative data practice. So we started with the acknowledgement that for data to be useful and to create outcomes and knowledge that is sustained and does not have significant negative consequences, there should be systemic learning. So the data we collect, the data we analyze, and the methods we employ to collect and analyze that data should be systemic and lead to a learning process and create knowledge outcomes. We also discussed that data should be ethical. The processes, the practices should follow a guideline which is developed by considering the different ethical considerations people have in the places and in their respective positions. Then we touched upon the very important aspect of why participatory and engaged processes are necessary for data to be generative. This involves understanding our role as researchers, understanding the context, positionality, and the cultural attributes of people, and this will not happen unless there is deep engagement and participation of a diverse variety of people in the data process. And then finally, we discussed why it is important for data collection processes and methods to be context sensitive. Every context is different because of its geographical location, because of its culture and history, and because of the people that live there. Now, in terms of systemic learning, we looked at a framework on how data can lead to systemic learning. There are three critical attributes to it. First, it should be agential. That means it should look at people as individuals, as entities, or in other collections across the social scales. Now, when we talk about social scales, there inherently comes the idea of different layers. So to match that, our inquiry should be multi-layered. That means it should span across the different organizational layers and account for relationships that people have with institutions, infrastructure along the social fabric. And then for this information to be validated and for this information to be reliable over time, not just the moment, the snapshot of time in which this was collected, for this relevant to be reliable and relevant over time, this should be cross-referenced through multiple sources and modes of information collection, leading to a high degree of confidence in the actions that would result from analyzing this data. So today we dwell deeper into the systemic learning aspect and look at a very important attribute of people-centered, user-centered data collection for research and actions. So as you all might already know, every data process begins with a question. It does not have to be a very refined and very narrow question, but there is definitely a broad driving question that is informing our inquiry. In this context, the reason why we are participating in this training, we are all interested in development, we are all interested in innovation and generating social value out of those innovations. So a broad driving question here is, how do infrastructure and infrastructure services interact with human and social development? Now, this question is intentionally broad so that we can refine it as we get more information. So why are social value maps relevant, and what are social value maps? So if you recall, we discussed a layered structure of an inquiry, where at the center of this layered structure of inquiry are the users or the people. So a social value map presents a profile of the value proposition that the infrastructure and infrastructure services presents and can present in the future for people or end users of that infrastructure service. Now, let us ground our discussion today in energy systems, energy as a form of infrastructure and infrastructure service. We will take that as an illustration case. Of course, that can be replaced by any other infrastructure or infrastructure service like water, sanitation, any economic activity, manufacturing, production, any sort of infrastructure can be correlated to the value proposition it can create potentially for its end users and recipients, and a social value map can be drawn out. Let's get deeper into that. So what do we understand by social value? So we are taking energy as our example case. So let us think about the social value of energy. Now, in very simple terms, we are trying to profile the benefits, the burdens, the trade-offs, and the risks that the energy system and the energy service presents to its end users, right? Why do we need this? Because very intuitively, we want to maximize benefits, we want to minimize burdens, we want to ensure that the trade-offs are not significant and create burdens over time. And obviously, we do not want to increase the risks in social, economic, ecological terms for the end users or recipients of this infrastructure intervention, right? So now in concrete terms, what would those benefits, burdens, trade-offs, and risks look like? So the outcomes of an infrastructure service, in our case, energy, we are looking at outcomes in terms of capabilities and freedoms that are affected for the energy users. So by the use of energy, by the utilization of energy, or by the infrastructure being present in my periphery, what are the kinds of outcomes being generated, and are those outcomes beneficial, burdensome, or risky for my capabilities and freedoms to pursue my well-being aspirations? Now, this can be applicable to an individual, to an household, or any unit of analysis that we are interested in. Usually, we are interested in several of those units of analysis. We would like to have generative outcomes for individuals. We would like to have generative outcomes for households, the local economy, local businesses, a variety of actors. And this relates back to the critical attribute of our data inquiry being agential. So the next step that we need to build over this idea of enhancing or reducing capabilities and freedoms is that agential diversity. So the agential diversity can be formed by a range of social, technical, and ecological agents, right? So you see individuals, local economies, families, and households, infrastructure and ecology also feature here as agents. So it's critical to understand that agents can be animate individuals and families and households, living beings, in other words, or agents can also be inanimate objects like infrastructures, uh, uh, institutions, and environmental services. Because although they might not fit the definition of a living organism, they do have their own dynamics and they influence the way society functions and impacts individuals. So for our inquiry, all of these would be agents. So now we have grounded our inquiry into the capabilities and freedoms uh, in the diversity of agents that are relevant or can be relevant to a particular uh, case of social value map. So what's missing here now? How do we connect capabilities and these agents? What we need here is a set of intervening mechanisms through which capabilities are generated for the agents, and the agents can then utilize those capabilities to improve their well-being outcomes. So those intervening mechanisms are a variety of human, social, and technical processes that connect the interactions between agents and infrastructure services. So these could be uh, the human capital in a particular place, uh, cultural identities, ethics, or these could be very concrete infrastructural mechanisms like financial flows and processes, or governance mechanisms, or information technology, markets, natural resources, right? And then there is obviously the social element of power, politics, uh, and participation. So there are a variety of intervening mechanisms, and there could be more as you go into a particular situation and context. You can identify unique intervening mechanisms in a particular place, and that would populate this view. So now we have a picture where we have agents and we have the intervening mechanisms, and our data collection is now guided to mapping out the different sort of capabilities and freedoms that are being produced, uh, diminished, or not affected by these interactions, and categorize them as beneficial, burdensome, risky, or as a significant trade-off. So this gives you a framework to start building an inquiry for collecting data that would answer that question of what is valuable and what is not. Translating this into a questionnaire, which is what most of us would want to do uh, with this social value inquiry, is that we would want to translate this into a set of concrete questions that could be asked to research participants. So in a tabular form, what I've done here is translated um, the figure, the schematic in the previous slide, to a table where you can frame questions at the intersection of the X and Y axis. So take, for example, human and social capital capacities, the first top Y axis variable, and the first X axis variable, the individual well-being. Now, this intersection gives you the opportunity to frame questions for inquiring about the capabilities and freedoms at the intersection of what kind of capital, social capital exists, or capacities exist in terms of, this could be education, this could be technical skills, this could be access to finance, and many other forms of human and social capital and capacities, and relate that to individual well-being. So for an individual, how does this translate into capabilities and freedoms that lets them pursue beneficial outcomes? Several questions can be framed using this table at the intersection of one or more elements, right? So what I would like to do now is instigate you to think about certain questions using the social value map framework. So what you see on your screen is a set of pictures from a location, which I'll tell you about more about later, is a picture representing a situation in a particular community. So I will give you some time to take in all of these pictures, maybe draw a mental picture. And then I would like you to create a set of questions um, that would lead you towards creating a social value map for this particular location. Okay, so starting now, 2 minutes to take in the pictures and ask any questions. If you have any clarifying questions about the pictures, feel free to ask me. Okay, start. I hope you're making notes as you go through these pictures. Because I would need to go back and show you the other screen so that you have the social value mapping framework for your reference as well. All right, ready? Let me know on the chat if you're ready to start asking questions to these pictures. All right, so what I would like you to do now is, based on these pictures, they don't have to be very accurate, but frame a set of questions to understand the social value proposition of an off-grid energy system, off-grid solar mini-grid for this particular community, and what identify the value proposition for the different kinds of agents you can see in these pictures, right? So once again, frame a set of questions to identify the social value proposition of an off-grid solar mini-grid project for this community that you see in your pictures. Okay. You have 5 minutes to frame a set of questions. It does not have to be very elaborate. 2, 3, 4 questions should be good enough. And let me know if you want me to switch the screen back to the the table or the schematic diagram for social value of energy maps. All right, so Lori says table. So here is the table for your reference. So just as a reminder, on the x-axis, the green boxes are the different kinds of agents. If you have identified a class of agents from the pictures which is not here in the table, feel free to add. And on the y-axis, the yellow boxes are the different mechanisms that translate infrastructure services to capacity, capabilities, and freedoms. If you are ready, feel free to share on the chat. Or if you want me to switch back to the pictures, let me know as well.
Hi, Sarah. Jomo here. You
Yeah,
actually
Joe.
you actually wanted us to present the questions on the chat, right? For the question.
Yes.
Oh, okay. Great. That's the clarification there. Thanks.
Sure. Yeah. We'll take another minute to think about your questions and your line of inquiry for this community, and then we will open up the floor to a discussion and discuss the questions that you have framed. Okay, I see some interesting questions coming up on the chat. Remember, you now have the opportunity to ask very specific questions to your participants because you have deconstructed the relationship between an infrastructure service, energy in this case, and the different ways in which people, as individuals, as families, as business persons, achieve uh, well-being outcomes, right? So you can be very specific in the question that you ask.
Yes, thanks for the clarification, Sarah. Because in my case, I was wondering whether I was being too specific again.
Mm-hmm.
And just note that I think of more broadly how we can have a framework to get to the specific. So my questions are looking at how we can have a set of questions that are consistent to help us dig to those
Correct.
deeper level. So
correct.
So both sides, yeah. I just so you know how I'm responding on that. I think more of the system at the systematic level.
Correct. I can see that, and that's a very good point, Lori. So I'll build on your point, and so by now you must have realized as you tried to frame your questions that it's very difficult to capture all of this with one question, right? So this is basically pointing to a line of inquiry for you. So as a researcher, you have a line of inquiry now. It can be one question, it can be broken down into several. The questions can be asked over time, over different engagement opportunities with your research participants. So what this framework is providing you is a line of inquiry that lets you be very specific on the different kinds of outcomes and the different kinds of agents that you see. You can ask questions to people in their homes and about utilization of energy and improving outcomes inside the house, inside their home. You can ask people questions at their workplace and may help them think through the process of utilizing energy and the infrastructure that comes along with the energy service to improve outcomes at their workplace, right? Similarly, at public places and other infrastructure services. Then you can ask them questions which are very specific about participation, about having their voices heard, having their choices and grievances being addressed. You can also look into the future opportunities, like what can be 5 years down the line, 10 years down the line, how the service can grow and improve so that there is a consistent improvement in well-being outcomes for people, right? So this framework provides you a very specific line of inquiry into the multiple facets of the interaction between individuals or agents and the infrastructure system. Okay, so what I'll do now is tell you a little story about this community, and then you can tell me what questions you have in trying to understand the role of energy in creating sustainable development outcomes for this particular community. Right, so this is a community in southeast of Nepal. As you can see from the pictures, it's on the mountain side, so difficult terrain. There's a river at the bottom, the foot of the hill, and this community is higher at a higher altitude on the hill. This community is essentially a stopover for tourists that take the bus from the southern towns in Nepal to the north. This is also frequented by tourists who go to the Mount Everest base camp. So this is a halt where people stop, the buses stop to refuel, people get down to grab water and food. This is also a marketplace for several smaller communities in the area. So people come from nearby villages to shop here. There are several restaurants, guest houses, bed and breakfast places at this place, and the community is largely engaged in commercial activities and a few agriculturists and boatmen who live here. So a couple of years ago, with an implementation partner in Nepal, I had the opportunity to go live in this community for some time and understand the social value proposition of energy, of an off-grid, of a solar mini-grid system. Now, this mini-grid system would supply electricity. To begin with, it would replace the diesel generators that are currently providing electricity. It would replace that service and increase the service duration from few hours in a day and strive towards being a 24/7 electricity system and pay for itself. So this project is the first private investment in Nepal for a mini grid, where there has been no additional funding from a development agency or government. This is a partnership between a private developer and the community. So the idea was to, over time, as the capital investment is returned, the service parameters of the system would be enhanced, and this would become a self-sustained electricity supply system for this community. Now, in terms of livelihoods, this community is majorly engaged in commercial activities like restaurants, stores, other kind of retail businesses, agricultural processing, transportation activities using boats and other forms of transport, and vehicle repair businesses. These are the major forms of occupations in this community. Now, the question here is not what kind of technology would be most appropriate, or that was not the starting point. The starting point was, how do we enhance the quality of the livelihood activities in this community? How do we enhance the living conditions of people by improving services inside the home? How do we improve the experiences of the tourists who stop over, and the transport companies who have offices and have used this community as a stopover? How do we enhance the experience and, as a result, create a better experience for them, and at the same time address the fragile ecological conditions in this community? You can see that it's on the edge of a hill. It's an area which floods frequently. This is also an earthquake-prone area. So how do we build infrastructure that is resilient and provides backup in case of a natural disaster, which are not uncommon in this area? So starting with those set of questions, we created social value maps for this particular community. Now, before I go on and show you what we found by posing the questions for creating social value in this community, I would like to hear from you. What questions would you pose? You have written a lot of, I see a lot of responses on the chat, but now with this additional background, what would your line of inquiry be? Where would you start? Feel free to unmute yourself and speak.
Well, I would think just based on you said like ecological issues, that you not only have to think about the fact that you can get the energy running 24/7 continuously, right? But how do you recover when there's a disaster? So you need a model that allows them to bounce back.
Correct.
And you also need, and in that, in my thought, this is how I think, that now links to, okay, well, the energy is great, but we now also have to teach like the companies how to bounce back as well. Because you can bounce back the energy, but if they can't bounce back their companies as well to, get back to production, then the energy is good, but it's not really useful to them. If it takes them a year to, to get back to full operation, then, if this is a paid project, right? If this is if they're paying for the energy, then they may not be able to pay you for a year. So it's not just the interconnection. Yes, the energy's there and it does a lot of things and it impacts a lot of things positively, but the issues, the complexity of issues in the environment then now impact the energy delivery.
Correct.
And so, yeah, go ahead. And then being able to pay or do the project successfully.
Absolutely. No. So what you did, Lori, very well here is connect using the social value of energy mapping framework. You connected economic activity, economic capability of different kinds of agents, whether they are households or businesses or the energy system operator themselves. You connected the financial capability of those agents to the infrastructure service, as well as the ecological risk. So you created, you brought in three issues to bear upon each other and posed a set of questions which would simultaneously address issues around those. Great job. Other comments, please. No other comments or questions on line of inquiry that comes to your mind?
All right, given the circumstances, especially not only the nature of the village, but because if you just consider the nature of the village, I think the PV system is good, is workable. But with earthquake, with mudslides, I'm seeing the mountain look kind of mud or earthen in a sense. I'm thinking if the appropriate system, you would definitely need a much cheaper system in terms of a microgrid, probably PV panels, rather than getting into the big infrastructure of, I know Nepal has a lot of micro hydro So I don't think that would be appropriate. So I think first thing, even what type of system you're gonna be investing in is a big question. And added to that would be the human capital in terms of maintenance and operation, because the village seems to, the economic activities and the skill level, one would have to do a survey of that to know what is available, because you don't want to go too heavy in terms of technology and then the training or the knowledge transfer process will be too elaborate. So I think these are some questions that can be raised.
So I would want to clarify certain things on your response, Mahendra. So where is the social value in this line of inquiry? You thought of technology options and you thought about the capacities that would be necessary to maintain those technology options. So what is the value proposition and who are the agents in this line of inquiry?
All right. Well, I think that would be the next step, because first we'll have to think of a solution that is sustainable. At least that's my way of thinking. If we have a solution that will not be able to withstand the environment and the ecological issues surrounding, then investing in persons, persons investing in like the equipment to mill or equipment to enhance their well-being, utilizing the community assets, farm products, and so on. How feasible would that be to go further in that line? So I'm thinking that we need to, it's a deeper understanding of the village and what they would do during these times of, let me say, earthquake or mudslides or whatever the case is. So you see so it's deeper than just making a pronouncement. So I would think we need to talk more to the village to understand what they would like to do, because eventually there will be a risk, and that risk might not be overwhelming in terms of losses. Let me put it that way.
Right. So what you described is in many ways a self-contradicting approach to data, because your data collection effort is fronted by a technological solution here. The entire idea of generative systems or collecting data for generative outcomes is to front end the value proposition and the capabilities proposition of the end users and people, and from there work towards identifying socio-technical solutions or interventions. So the problem with this approach would be if your data collection is biased by the technological choices that you have identified as constraints or limitations, then you are curtailing the possibility of the map. You are curtailing the opportunity space that can be created by engaging in a social value mapping exercise. So it is best to avoid front-ending a data exercise with technological solutions, any sort of solutions, which is essentially a bias. Remember, the purpose of data collection is to deconstruct. We are yet not at a solution stage. We are not providing the entire purpose of data collection in research is to frame and reframe the problem. Unless we have a good understanding of what the problem is, how the problem would evolve over time, over demographics, changes in the community, no solution would be a sustainable solution. And hence, the idea of social value of energy mapping being a people-centered, user-centered data exercise. Okay.
Can I,
Other
Sir Rob, can I make a comment? So, so in our case, we do have a quote unquote technical solution up front. However, we try to guide that by having objective data collection up front to make the adjustments to what would be implemented. That's why we spend so much time up front.
Mm-hmm.
We try not to, and this is because we have a lot of experience in the area, right, of the field that we're trying to work. And we've seen certain patterns across communities and areas, right, that hold true for the most part.
Mm-hmm.
But you still need to have the context specific information to make the appropriate integrated system for any particular community or cluster, right? So I do agree with you overall, but I'd say also that I think you can do both, but you have to train yourself to do both, right? You know, you can have an idea of what you want to put in, but you have to be able to do the data collection without guiding the data collection by that solution. Does that make sense, what I'm trying to say?
Correct, yes. So obviously everyone cannot be everything, right? Everyone does not bring in all the skill sets necessary. And that's why it's important to have a diversified workforce, a research workforce that can bring in multiple perspectives and look at the problem from multiple perspectives and angles. One of the perspectives is the user's perspective, or the people's perspective here. Now, when we pan this out and move towards the analytical end of what data we collect, we would obviously introduce other perspectives where the service providers or the technical experts' perspective would also come in, right? So this is one piece of the entire inquiry where we are focusing on the end user's perspective. And you're right that we cannot wish away the limitations of a technical solution. There are technical limitations to all technologies. There are limitations to what kind of business models and financial models exist. And the process, eventually the design problem would become trying to match these existing options with their limitations and the characteristics, right? But that's a design question. Right now, we are focusing on the data question. So it's important, as you have pointed out as well, to differentiate between the phases of the entire research process, where data needs to be separated from the bias of the limits a solution provides. Does that make sense?
Let me just contribute to that point you've just made, because I see one of the limitations that we might have, for example, in the system in the work that we're doing here, is that you're starting with minimal capital, really. So you do need that front ending with a technical solution, so that you can generate some income that allows you then to proceed with data collection. So how to balance those requirements and those needs, perhaps that's the issue. If you have backup in terms of a basic pool of resources to get you started, I see the value then of starting with purely data collection. But if you have limited resources, I would think that you would have to have a mix.
Okay.
In a project.
Okay. So let me maybe clarify that, Saurabh.
Yeah.
So we
Derek,
do separate
if you don't mind muting your microphone, there's some feedback.
I think it's Derek. Yeah, Derek. Okay. So in our case, we're working with, artisanal mining environments, right? And we do the data collection. It's open. In many ways, it's low cost to do that. But our first major milestone is to improve productivity and the production and the value chain, so that the miners and the communities are generating more revenue to help in their communities, correct? Now, these intermediate solutions then also help to pay for future development of a larger scale project, right? That would cover more of the community and so on and so forth. So I'm doing a trade-off in this. We do the data collection, it's separate, but the solution that we put in after we do that upfront data collection is what I would call an interim solution. It may not be the ultimate solution, but it does make significant improvements and moves the community forward. Because often in our case, because we're doing integrated development, which is like a 10-year, time span, it takes you 3 to 5 years to plan that, right? Or it takes 3 years to plan it, and then you're putting something in that's large enough, to help shift that area. And so we want to do a trade-off to give people enough positive benefit, right, in the first 3 years, and focus on the full transformation over the 7 years. Is that making sense? So we're trying to get them turned around enough, but in reality with development, there's a lot of pieces, right? So oftentimes, the community, they lose patience because it takes long, and we're talking about larger projects, right? We're not talking about like just a small, micro garden. It's integrated with a lot of different parts. So what we do is we do the analysis up front, the data collection, and we continue it, but we also put in a system that it's sustainable in the short term, but we don't necessarily, think that solution is going to be the long-term solution, is what I'm trying to say.
Sure.
But we try to do it in a way so that it's not creating negative impact, right? Because we really do have a long-term strategy. But the key thing is, to do that long-term strategy, you need a lot of money. So if you create an enterprise that's generating money in the short term, it gives you the capital you need to do the development to develop the larger project that will have greater impact. Is that making sense?
Yes. And what you described and what Derek was pointing out too is, I would say again, is a design question. It's not a data question, right?
Right.
What trade-offs are being created? What are the trade-offs that we agree to? You as a developer and the recipient, it's a process of mutually agreeing to certain trade-offs, right?
Exactly. Right.
So that is a design stage question that you would address. What we are doing here in collecting data is we are trying to map out the entire extent of imagination and aspiration. It does not mean that we would be able to design for all of it. Right. It does not mean that all the problems that have been identified through the process would be solved tomorrow as soon as we have identified it. Right. The question here is avoiding the curtailment of aspiration and imagination at a point where you don't need that to happen. What you need here is to find out the maximum possible extent of needs and aspirations in the community.
I agree.
Right?
Yes.
It's like if there is one slice of bread and you're hungry, you cannot control your hunger. You cannot quantify your hunger to be one slice of bread hungry or 5 slices of bread hungry. You're hungry, that's it. It's objectively hungry. It does not matter how much food is there in your fridge. Now the design question is, then you can decide, I'm hungry, I can eat all the food that's available right now and be hungry again at night, or I will satisfy some of my hunger now and save some for later. That's the design problem. But the fact that you're hungry does not go away and is not relative to the amount of food in the refrigerator. So this is the separation that we need to understand, that the extent of opportunity and aspiration is not limited by the resource constraints. The design is, the solution certainly is constrained by that, but not the opportunity. So,
yeah.
Right.
Yeah,
so
and that's, yeah.
Right.
I just want to.
No, go ahead.
Sorry, I was just going to say, so just for the people on my side of the context, I mean, that's absolutely correct. So what we say is you want to understand the problem and the people in order to understand the possibilities.
Right. So the entire point of doing a social value map is to identify the extent of opportunity, the extent of needs, and the extent of aspirations for a given context and a given set of people, right? So in this community, if I illustrate what we found when we implemented the social value of energy map, without being constrained by the size of the system, the limitations to the investment, and the other transactional parameters, we find different sorts of benefits that were identified by people uh, from the direct and indirect uses of energy. So you can see that here people identify some very basic needs. You can see the immediate nature of some of the problems that they have identified here. So the first set, the unmet or underpowered capabilities and freedoms, is what are the immediate needs. So basic lighting, education facilities, health outcomes, these are unmet needs and probably are the first set of energy services that needs to power. Then they go on to identifying ways that energy can help improve economic outcomes in existing professions. So for example, appliances that improve productivity for the restaurants or reduce costs of the product for tourists. Some essential services like water pumping for clean drinking water. These are an advanced level, not very advanced, but the next level of services that can create economic and non-economic benefits in the communities, right? But these are not unmet right now. These can be done over time. And then in sustained value creation over time and over generations, is they identify newer forms of economic activity that can be created in the community, like poultry and pig farming, which is not really the optimum without electricity. Improving living conditions, indoor air quality, plastic waste management in the communities are the higher end of the aspiration, right? So you can see the phases of your project emerging from this data. I wouldn't know what my phases should be if I did not know what are the different stages of aspirations that I can categorize using this data. Once I have mapped out the extent of aspirations and needs in the community, the project, depending upon whatever financial and technological constraints exist, can be planned to pan out over those phases. Similarly, when you look at the profile of burdens and risks in the community, you see a variety of burdens being currently existing or being able to emerge. For example, the economic burden of energy costs. It divides itself from medium to high burdens. Obviously, people who have the opportunity to turn energy access to income feel the burden less than people who do not have that opportunity. There is the possibility of loss of livelihood for certain actors who have been providing energy services in the absence of a well-maintained system. And then there's already the burden of a fragile ecology, which can be further worsened or prevented by designing a system that caters to the very specific needs of the ecological risk. Similarly, risks and trade-offs that can emerge is the divide in affordability over a period. This tells the designers on what to look out for as they plan out the phases and the financial structure behind their projects. There's a risk of children being employed in business activities. Once there is increase in business activity, the risk of children being pulled out of school and engaged in the family business is high. gender and economic justice issues, hegemony of social control of the powerful in the community, and other forms of risks. So these are critical inputs for project design at later stages. But to identify these benefits, burdens, and risk profile, we need to engage in a mapping exercise that is devoid of that bias of constraints. Once you have that, then you can bring in constraints as design questions. So to wrap up, we need to understand that data collection is a process that is the beginning of an entire research process of analysis and design. It precedes design, it precedes decision making, so it needs to be shorn of any bias. And in terms of for participatory data collection, it's critical that we engage at the correct place and time. We employ different kinds of modes and instruments to collect data and pay critical attention to the recording and storage of that data. So as a researcher, finally, before we wrap up, it's critical to reflect upon the role of the researcher in this sort of participatory data collection processes. The role is to facilitate. It's being a facilitator for people to think and relate information to you. It is not an exercise to inform or teach or introduce bias into people's thinking. It is also about setting the right expectations. You do not, you can skew information to make it unrepresentative if you do not set the right expectations. If you say the data being collected is for something that is unrealistic, it changes the sort of responses. So set the right expectation, be transparent in the data collection process. Maintaining integrity of the process and information is critical. Data collection is not a time where you experiment. You have done the thinking before you have hit the ground for collecting data. This is not the time to experiment and change. It's the time to maintain integrity and stick to the process. And from a human aspect, it is critical to enable safe engagement spaces where your participants do not feel intimidated or threatened by you or an external factor. All right, so that concludes the first part of generative data collection on social value mapping. Next, we will take up the other layers to create generative maps. So if you have any final questions, I'll be happy to take them now.
Yes, one question that I have is with this approach of data collection that's not front-ended by a specific vendor, in your experience, how long has it taken you to come to a place where you can enter the design stage? And how did you meet the costs associated with that process of data collecting?
So the projects that, if we take the example of the community that I share, the pictures I showed you today, the process of data collection to design to implementation lasted, it took about 4 months. And the critical part is that the design is an evolving design. So since it was front-ended by the social value aspiration, this is the process that the community repeats periodically and provides inputs to the system operators to upgrade design. So it's an ongoing design. When the system was built, it was a particular capacity. It was planned for particular financial parameters. Over time, after some time passed, there was another social value exercise that the community did by themselves and provided additional inputs that eventually led to increasing the size of the installed capacity, providing more services, and changing the tariff. So it's not about a hard start and a hard end. When you engage in participatory engaged processes or interventions, it's a phased process that spans over stages, and it's an iterative process where you have inputs, you have adaptations and modifications to the design, and you diversify. So for example, what started off as a intended energy mini grid now involves a water pumping infrastructure as well. It involves sanitation infrastructure. So it's not one project, it's a cluster of projects aimed at developing, creating development outcomes in the community.
I think that helps, because I think even in what, sorry to just make this quick comment, even in the proposals or the comments that Laurie made earlier on, there is a certain iterative processes that's going on, starting where you are with the community and what they have, but then get into the data collection. But I think the encouragement or the impact that you have made in the lecture today is the fact that we need to be as much as possible open-ended, and that process allowing to generate information that will open up opportunities and possibilities that may be hidden if we are focused on a particular venture at this time. I don't know whether I'm making sense, but that's what I'm picking up from our discussion this afternoon. And I thank you for.
I agree. I would end with the final message that do not curtail your imagination and creativity because there are constraints out there. There are two separate things. Actions can be constrained. Imagination does not have to be constrained. All right. Thank you for participating, everyone. I really enjoyed the lively discussion, and I hope to see you all again next week. Thank you.